So we're going to be looking at the anatomy of the urinary system. This is our three-quarter torso, and of course the kidneys and urinary bladder are in the abdominopelvic cavity, and that's obscured by the organs that you see here. So I'm going to take out the liver, and grab the stomach, and then pull out the small and large intestines along with the pancreas. So you can see in the abdominopelvic cavity the two kidneys. They actually are about 5 inches long, 2.5 inches wide, and shaped like kidney beans, hence the name kidneys. The kidneys produce urine. The urine drains out of the kidneys by way of the ureters to the urinary bladder. In order to see the urinary bladder, I have to pull out the reproductive inset. So I'm going to pull out the reproductive inset and then pull this apart. So we looked at these structures when we talked about the female reproductive anatomy. This blue would be the cartilage associated with the pubic symphysis, where the coxal bones come together, and then directly behind it would be the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder has a inner lining that's wrinkled, and that's one way you can tell it from the smooth lining of the uterus. So the urinary bladder receives urine from the two kidneys by way of the ureters. The urinary bladder is a storage organ. It doesn't make urine, it doesn't modify urine, it simply stores urine until you void your bladder when you urinate. So the urinary bladder is drained by the urethra, and in females, of course, the urethral orifice is in the vestibule region within the labial folds. The urinary system consists of the two kidneys, the ureters that drain each kidney, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Those are the components of the urinary system. Whenever you have a series of tubes or tube-like organs that are interconnected, they're referred to as a tract. So sometimes you hear about the urinary tract. Now, a lot of structures associated with the kidney begin with the word renal, and renal means kidney. So this would be the renal capsule that I'm touching with my finger, and then beneath it, in the outermost region of the kidney, would be the renal cortex. Below the renal cortex is the renal medulla, and it consists of these red-colored structures, to include the lighter-colored tip. And these red-colored structures in the renal medulla are known as renal pyramids. They're pyramidal shaped. So the medulla of the kidney is made up of 8 to 10 of these renal pyramids. And the renal pyramids are triangular shaped in 2 dimensions, which is what we see here. But this would be the base of the triangle here, and then it would come down like this, and here's a triangle there, and a triangle here, and a triangle there, and each of these triangular regions are known as renal pyramids. Each of the renal pyramids has a base along here that's at the border between the medulla and the cortex, and then this lighter colored area would be the apex of a renal pyramid, which is known as the papilla, or the renal papilla. So here's another triangular shaped renal pyramid, the base, and this would be a renal papilla. The papilla of each renal pyramid juts into a minor calyx, and then several minor calyces merge to form what's called a major calyx. And the major calyces join together right here, just inside the kidney, to form what's known as the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis inside the kidney becomes, and it's just continuous, the ureter. So, the internal components of the kidney include the renal capsule, renal cortex, renal medulla made of renal pyramids, and the calyces and the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is inside the kidney, and it becomes, when it leaves the kidney, the ureter. So this region on the medial side of each kidney is known as the renal hilum, sometimes called the renal hilus. So it's either H-I-L-U-M or H-I-L-U-S. It's personal preference. And this region right here on the medial side of the kidney, known as the renal hilum, is where the renal artery enters the kidney, the renal vein exits the kidney, and the ureter begins. You can see some fine detail right here, and these are microscopic urine-forming structures found in the kidneys, known as nephrons. So parts of the nephron are found in the cortex and parts are found in the medulla. So what we're going to end up doing is taking a wedge out of this kidney, and it's a wedge that will include the renal capsule, renal cortex, and one renal pyramid within the renal medulla. And we're going to take this wedge out and then enlarge it right here next to the whole kidney. So this would be a wedge taken from the whole kidney, and this would be the renal capsule, renal cortex, and a renal pyramid, one of many in the renal medulla region of the kidney. So these structures that you see in a yellowish color would be what are called nephrons. And nephrons make urine. There's over 1 million nephrons per kidney. So once you know what one nephron looks like, you pretty much know what all the others look like. And if there's over 1 million per kidney, that would be, considering that there's 2 kidneys, you know, over 2 million of these nephrons working simultaneously to make urine. So each of the nephrons consist of a renal corpuscle, that's this ball-like structure here, and what's known as a renal tubule. So let me tell you about the renal corpuscles, or these ball-like structures, first. Each renal corpuscle consists of a glomerular capsule, and inside the glomerular capsule is a capillary network known as a glomerulus, sometimes called glomerular capillaries. So if you notice, they've kind of lopped off the top of a renal corpuscle, so you can see the glomerular capillaries inside of it. And let's take one of these renal corpuscles and make it bigger. So when you look at this large renal corpuscle, you can see that it consists of a glomerular capsule, and inside the glomerular capsule would be a capillary network known as a glomerulus. Now the glomerular capsule goes all the way around the glomerular capillaries. So if I added back what they have taken off, then this would be the rest of the glomerular capsule, and you wouldn't be able to see the glomerular capillaries inside. But if you take off the top of the glomerular capsule, then obviously you can see the glomerular capillaries. So each glomerular capillary network is fed by an afferent arteriole with a large diameter. Afferent means towards, in this case carries blood towards or into the glomerular capillaries. And these capillaries are drained by smaller diameter arteriole called the efferent arteriole. So that's a little odd because normally a capillary bed is fed by an arteriole and drained by a venule, and that's not the case with this special network of capillaries called the glomerulus, associated with a renal corpuscle. Instead, there is an afferent arteriole that delivers blood into the glomerular capillaries, and they are drained by another arteriole called an efferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole has a larger diameter than the efferent arteriole, and afferent means towards, and efferent means away, and those words are with respect to the glomerulus. So, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, or glomerular capillaries, inside of the glomerular capsule together make up a renal corpuscle. So back to the nephron. So each of these nephrons consist of a renal corpuscle, and that in turn is made up of a glomerular capsule, and inside the glomerular capsule would be the glomerulus, or glomerular capillaries. Glomerulus and glomerular capillaries can be used interchangeably. They mean the same thing. Every renal corpuscle gives rise to what's called a proximal convoluted tubule, or proximal tubule, that then goes down deep and comes back up. In other words, makes a loop. And this loop is called the loop of Henle, or a nephron loop. And loop of Henle and nephron loop mean the same thing. So generally in textbooks, it is often known as a nephron loop, but like fallopian tube, in common usage, people generally refer to it as the loop of Henle. And I'll say loop of Henle or nephron loop, and I just pick one or the other. So the renal corpuscle gives rise to the proximal convoluted tubule, and that forms a nephron loop that leads to a distal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule drains into what's known as a collecting duct. So the nephron consists of the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule, where the renal tubule consists of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. So the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule are windy tubes, and another word for windy is convoluted. So this shows the two kidneys drained by the ureters, and the ureters carry urine to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder does not make urine. It's simply a storage bag where you store urine as it accumulates, and then at some point in time you void your bladder by peeing, and that's when the urine drains from the urinary bladder down the urethra and out the urethral orifice to the outside of the body. This would be a renal artery and a renal vein. The renal artery coming off the abdominal aorta, and the renal vein carrying blood from the kidneys into the inferior vena cava. So on top of the kidneys would be the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are the source of epinephrine, cortisol, and aldosterone. And we'll be talking more about the adrenal glands when we hit the endocrinology section. Actually, I'm going to mention a few things about aldosterone during the urinary system discussions. So let's take this down. Here's a picture that shows more detail of the urinary bladder. So here would be the kidneys draining urine down the ureters to the urinary bladder, And this would be the openings where the ureters are carrying urine or spilling it into the lumen of the urinary bladder, sometimes just called the bladder, and the bladder being drained in this case by the urethra. This would be a urethra of a female. By the way, the urethra of females is much shorter than it would be in guys, because in guys the urethra has to pass all the way down the length of the penis. So there are a couple muscles that I want you to know, because we'll be talking about these muscles when I tell you about what's known as micturition. So one would be a smooth muscle called the internal urethral sphincter, and it's embedded within the urethra, right where the urethra begins at the base of the urinary bladder, and it's a smooth muscle. So normally this smooth muscle, the internal urethral sphincter, is contracted, and that seals off the urethra as urine fills in the urinary bladder. That muscle, the internal urethral sphincter muscle, when you pee, relaxes, and then urine flows out of the urinary bladder into the urethra. You don't necessarily pee at that point because you can hold it back by contracting a skeletal muscle known as the external urethral sphincter muscle. And when you contract that muscle, it clamps down on the urethra to hold urine back until you relax that muscle. So this is a look at a sagittal section of the kidney, reminiscent of the model we looked at. And this would be the renal capsule. And below the renal capsule would be the renal cortex. These triangular shaped structures here would be the renal pyramids that make up the renal medulla. And each renal pyramid has a, I was trying to think of, has a tip of it known as the renal papilla. And a renal papilla opens into a minor calyx, and the minor calyces join to form a major calyx, and the major calyces form the renal pelvis. And at the hilum or hilus, which is right here on the medial side of the kidney, the renal pelvis becomes the ureter. There are columns called renal columns found between the renal pyramids. So I didn't mention those when I was taking a look at the model, but I do want you to know that the medulla consists of renal pyramids separated by renal columns. So this is pretty much the same thing, but it is a lead-in to talk about the nephrons. So what they've done here is to, again, take kind of a wedge out of the kidney and enlarge it. So this would be the renal capsule, the renal cortex. This would be a renal pyramid, one of many in the renal medulla. And this right here would be the structures associated with a nephron. Again, nephrons are microscopic urine-forming units found in the kidney, and there's over 1 million nephrons per kidney. So each nephron consists of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. And the renal corpuscle consists of the glomerular capsule with the glomerulus, a ball of capillaries inside of it. And the renal tubule consists of the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, and the distal tubule. The structure right here, going all the way down to the papilla of a renal pyramid, is a collecting duct. So this shows the nephron larger. That makes it kind of easier to pick out the structures. This right here would be the renal corpuscle. And the renal corpuscle consists of a glomerular capsule inside of which would be the glomerulus. And the glomerular capsule portion of a renal corpuscle becomes the proximal tubule, also known as a proximal convoluted tubule. And the proximal tubule becomes a loop, and that's going down and coming back up, known as the nephron loop, also called the loop of Henle. And the nephron loop gives rise to a windy tube called the distal tubule, or distal convoluted tubule. The renal corpuscle and the renal tubule together make up a nephron. So the nephron consists of a glomerular capsule and the glomerulus. Together they're called a renal corpuscle. And the renal tubule consists of the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, and the distal tubule. The collecting duct is not part of a nephron. It's a structure shared by many nephrons, because the distal tubules of nephrons empty into a collecting duct. And this would be a distal tubule and a distal tubule and a distal tubule here of additional nephrons that aren't shown on this illustration. So this is telling you that this area right here is in the renal cortex, and the nephron loops have dipped down into the renal medulla, and the collecting duct is going down all the way to the papilla at the end of the renal pyramid of the renal medulla. This illustration adds the blood supply to a nephron. So there are a system of arteries that get smaller and smaller off the renal artery, and eventually this system of branching arteries leads to what's known as an afferent arteriole. So this would be an afferent arteriole delivering blood to a glomerular set of capillaries, and the glomerular capillaries inside a glomerular capsule, and the glomerular capillaries are also known as the glomerulus. The glomerular capillaries, or the glomerulus, is drained by an efferent arteriole. And the efferent arteriole leads to a network of capillaries around the renal tubule known as the paratubular capillaries. And then the paratubular capillaries lead to small veins that ultimately lead to the renal vein and back to the inferior vena cava to the right atrium of the heart. Okay, this would be the renal corpuscle, consisting of the glomerular capsule and the glomerular capillaries. And the renal corpuscle gives rise to a proximal tubule, loop of Henle, and a distal tubule. So what they've done here is just take the renal corpuscle and make it bigger. So the renal corpuscle consists of, they've lopped the top off this, but the renal corpuscle consists of a glomerular capsule, and inside the glomerular capsule would be a network of capillaries known as the glomerular capillaries, or simply the glomerulus. Each network of glomerular capillaries, or the glomerulus, is fed by an afferent arteriole delivering blood into the capillaries. And these capillaries are drained by an efferent arteriole that takes blood to the paratubular capillaries. Within a glomerular capsule is the capsular space. And we're going to find that blood plasma is filtered through the glomerular capillaries into the glomerular capsular space, and from the capsular space, this filtrate that forms travels into a proximal convoluted tubule, or a proximal tubule. So we're going to look at this in more detail. Some of that will be covered in the lecture video. So this just kind of shows several things. You may want to take a look at this in your lab book as well. All these illustrations are important. You really got to kind of study them to be able to sift through all this and learn it. So this is going to be an afferent arteriole delivering blood into the glomerulus, which would be a network of capillaries inside the glomerular capsule. And the glomerular capsule and the glomerular capillaries together make up this spherical structure known as the as the renal corpuscle. By the way, the glomerular capsule is also known as Bowman's capsule. The glomerular capsule of the renal corpuscle then gives rise to a proximal tubule, and the proximal tubule forms a loop called the loop of Henle, and we'll find that there's a descending branch of the loop of Henle and an ascending branch. And the ascending branch of the loop of Henle becomes the distal tubule, and that's a nephron. So the nephron is the renal corpuscle and the components of the renal tubule. And then the distal tubule portion of a nephron drains into a collecting duct.